While many scholars place the Exodus in the 13th century BCE within the realm of historical consideration, concrete evidence of Exodus-like events from that era remains elusive. In contrast, the 14th century BCE appears to resonate more closely with biblical narratives. Recent studies suggesting that epidemics could have caused a significant gap in Amenhotep III's documentation, reigning from 1390 to 1353 BCE, and other insights into his rule hint at the possibility of him being the pharaoh during the Exodus. This video aims to demonstrate the alignment of biblical accounts with major events of the 14th century BCE, setting the Exodus during Amenhotep III's reign around 1374 BCE allows us to explore potential Egyptian developments that might have influenced the biblical narrative leading up to the Exodus. Ariel Kozloff, an Egyptologist, has highlighted a notable hiatus in the extensive records of Amenhotep III's reign, suggesting a period of national crisis. This pause coincides with documented evidence of widespread epidemics, possibly linked to the biblical 10th plague. Kozloff points to the deaths of key officials and family members, including Amenhotep III's firstborn son, and his in-laws Tuya and Yuya, attributed to malaria. During this turbulent period, Amenhotep III commissioned numerous statues of the war and plague goddess Sekhmet, likely as part of efforts to appease or seek protection from the epidemics. The significance of Sekhmet's worship in biblical context is intriguing, possibly connecting to Egyptian myths where Sekhmet's actions mirror the biblical plagues. Amenhotep III's lavish lifestyle, wealth accumulation, and self-deification are reminiscent of biblical prohibitions against Israelite kings emulating such behaviors. His reign, marked by personal extravagance and theological assertions, contrasts sharply with the subsequent Amarna revolution led by his son Akhenaten. Akhenaten's radical religious reforms triggered a theological civil war that spanned decades, leading to the suppression of traditional Egyptian gods and subsequent attempts by later pharaohs to erase Akhenaten's legacy. The 10 plagues and the upheaval caused by the Amarna revolution were profound challenges to Egypt's religious and political stability, illustrating a divine judgment according to biblical narratives. Amid these internal struggles, Egypt faced external threats from Canaanite city-states and nomadic groups, potentially explaining the prolonged silence of the Egyptian army. This period of upheaval and divine intervention, as depicted in biblical texts, intertwines with historical accounts of Egypt's tumultuous era under Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. Amenhotep III's lavish lifestyle and behaviors may have influenced biblical laws. His immense wealth, noted as rich in horses according to a Malkatajar label, and his reputation as a womanizer are traits explicitly discouraged for Israelite kings in Deuteronomy 17:16-17. These aspects of Amenhotep III's reign served as a contrast to the moral and ethical standards expected of Israelite rulers. Amenhotep III took the unprecedented step of declaring himself a god during his lifetime, a practice unheard of among previous pharaohs. If the 10 plagues indeed occurred during his reign, they would have demonstrated his inability to uphold cosmic order and stability, Ma'at. His self-deification could be viewed as a personal and theological reaffirmation, perhaps in response to the challenges posed by these catastrophic events. Akhenaten, the son of Amenhotep III, initiated the Amarna Revolution, a prolonged theological conflict that unfolded over 5 decades. Following Akhenaten's death, a series of pharaohs endeavored to restore the ancient gods and erase all traces of Akhenaten's rule. This period saw a significant upheaval in religious practices and beliefs. The 10 plagues mentioned in the Bible were a direct challenge to the traditional Egyptian deities, as noted in Numbers 33:4. However, the theological crisis sparked by the Amarna Revolution and its aftermath represented an even more profound manifestation of divine judgment against these deities, as illustrated in Exodus 12:12. This upheaval marked a pivotal moment in ancient Egyptian history, with lasting implications for religious thought and practice. As the theological conflict raged, Egypt's Canaanite city-states engaged in internal strife and clashes with nomadic leaders, posing a dual threat to Egypt's dominance and its tribute collection. Surprisingly, the Egyptian military remained inactive for an extended period, prompting speculation about the reasons behind this inaction. One might ponder whether the army's lack of action was related to the epidemics mentioned by Kozlov. This hypothesis aligns with Moses' observation in Deuteronomy 11:4, where he suggests that God had decimated the Egyptian army. This period of military silence amid regional turmoil raises intriguing questions about the interplay of divine intervention, political dynamics, and historical events in ancient Egypt. The Bible recounts numerous encounters between Moses and Pharaoh, including an instance where Moses departs from the city where Pharaoh resides, Exodus 9:33. Given that Amenhotep III's capital was in Memphis during the early part of his reign, Moses would have faced the choice of either finding accommodation within or near Memphis, or making frequent journeys over a considerable distance if the Israelites were located well north of Memphis, near Avaris or the Wadi Tumilat, as commonly believed. However, if the Israelites lived near Heliopolis, as suggested by Josephus, Moses would have had a shorter travel distance to Memphis from his base of operations. There are several reasons to believe that the Israelites resided near Heliopolis. Joseph likely arrived in Egypt during the Hyksos rule. Appointed as the overseer of food accumulation and distribution in preparation for the Great Famine, he was probably stationed near a temple with large warehouses used for such purposes. It is plausible that a Hyksos pharaoh chose the daughter of a major Heliopolitan priest as Joseph's wife, rather than a priest of his principal deity Seth, because Joseph was to be based in Heliopolis. He settled his family nearby, as mentioned in Genesis 45:10. Joseph may have wanted to keep his family away from the Hyksos capital, Avaris, anticipating that the Egyptians would eventually rebel against these foreign rulers. This concern is reflected in his statement that all shepherds are detestable to Egyptians, as mentioned in Genesis 46:34. MANETHO'S implication that Egyptians derisively referred to the Hyksos as shepherds may help explain this statement, especially since animal husbandry was not generally abhorred in Egypt, as mentioned in Genesis 47:17. Indeed, Goshen, the region frequently identified as where the Israelites lived, may be a Hebrew composite of Gosh, meaning near, and on, which is Heliopolis. The theory that Ramesses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus is widely accepted and primarily based on the Bible's explicit mention of two locations called Ramesses or RAMESSES. The land of Ramesses, where the Israelites are said to have lived as mentioned in Genesis 47:11, suggests an association with a pharaoh bearing that name. Additionally, the store city, RAMESSES, as mentioned in Exodus 1:11, is interpreted by leading scholars to undoubtedly refer to Ramesses II's grand palace, Pi-Ramesses. Despite these strong suggestions, using place names to identify the pharaoh of the Exodus is peculiar, especially since the Bible refrains from directly naming that pharaoh. Therefore, it is possible that the terms Ramesses and RAMESSES might have different meanings. Starting with Ramesses, it seems unnecessary to use it to identify the region settled by the Israelites, especially since the area is called Goshen everywhere else in Genesis. Even Pharaoh's order, Genesis 47:6, refers to Goshen, not Ramesses. There are at least two possible explanations. First, Moses may have added the reference to Ramesses to help future generations locate the Israelite settlement. The Bible implies that Moses was raised among influential families in the Delta, so he may have known that the Delta would eventually be associated with the RAMESSES. Alternatively, the term might have been added after Moses' death, along with other possible post-Mosaic additions identified by the biblical commentator Ibn Ezra, Deuteronomy 1:2. The second toponym, RAMESSES, Exodus 1:11, refers to one of the store cities where Israelite slave labor was used. Over their century-long enslavement, the Israelites likely worked on various sites. In fact, the authors of the Septuagint added a reference to Heliopolis in Exodus 1:11. RAMESSES is pronounced differently from Ramesses, a distinction that Ibn Ezra considers significant. Perhaps RAMESSES is a contraction of RAAMESSES, meaning RAAMESSES, a syncretized reference to the temples of two of the three predominant deities in northern Egypt, Ra and Seth. Alternatively, RAMESSES may have been another post-Mosaic addition. In 1 Kings 6:1, it is stated that the Exodus occurred 480 years prior to the construction of the first temple, which is reasonably dated to 966 BCE. The year 1374 BCE falls within the documentation gap reported by Kozlov and can be said to meet the 480-year criterion, even if not precisely. Using this date as a reference point, we can date two important milestones on the Israelites' path to the Exodus and look for non-biblical correlations. The Israelites' journey to the Exodus began with Jacob's arrival in Egypt. Rabbinic commentators estimate this event took place 210 years before the Exodus, which would be around 1584 BCE according to our timeline. They were driven to Egypt by a widespread famine that began 2 years earlier, as mentioned in Genesis 45:11. Considering the volcanic eruption occurred around the same time, it is quite plausible that the biblical famine was one of its far-reaching effects. Rabbinic commentators estimate that the Israelites were first enslaved sometime between 116 and 86 years before the Exodus. Based on our Exodus dating, this places the start of their enslavement at the beginning of Thutmose III's reign, when his aunt and stepmother Hatshepsut was on the throne. In her Speos or Temidos inscription, Hatshepsut appears to boast about expelling the Hyksos. We know this to be untrue. However, the late Egyptologist Hans Goedicke interpreted the inscription as claiming that she rid Egypt of the Israelites, who may have been the last remnant of the Hyksos. Goedicke understood the final phrase in the relevant passage, "The earth has swallowed their footsteps," as referring to the Exodus itself. However, this phrase might have been a common pharaonic exaggeration, leaving open the possibility that she was boasting about ridding Egypt of the Israelites by enslaving them. The thesis proposed in this video, identifying the pharaohs who enslaved and later released the Israelites, may find support from a non-biblical source. Manetho, a 3rd century BCE Egyptian priest and historian, wrote two supposedly historical accounts preserved by Josephus. These accounts describe expulsions from Egypt over 1,000 years earlier, involving groups that resemble the early Israelites. In the first account, the Hyksos are said to have settled in Jerusalem after their expulsion. In the second account, lepers and other diseased persons were enslaved and then released, eventually rebelling under a law-giving leader named Moses. The very same pharaohs linked to the enslavement and subsequent release of the biblical Israelites in this video are central to Manetho's accounts. A Thutmose pharaoh expelled the Hyksos, and Amenhotep III expelled the lepers. Despite questions about the authenticity and sources of these accounts, the relevant portions can be historically interpreted in support of the Exodus thesis presented here. The Hyksos account, according to Manetho, purportedly relied on records maintained by the priests of Heliopolis. It appears to combine the actual expulsion of the Hyksos, as well as Hatshepsut's version of events, and the interpretation by Goedicke regarding her claim. The account asserts that the Hyksos were expelled in 2 phases by 2 pharaohs, although not by Thutmoses. The priestly author of the account might have attributed the expulsion to the Thutmoses because Hatshepsut belonged to this dynasty. Specifically, Thutmose III was highlighted possibly due to his actions following Hatshepsut's death, where he sought to replace her name with his in Egyptian records. Goedicke's interpretation of Hatshepsut's claim provides insight into the connection made between the Hyksos and Jerusalem. Ultimately, the Israelites established their capital in Jerusalem, which may have been noted by historians in Heliopolis when their princess married King Solomon. Manetho's second account, possibly drawn from oral traditions known to the priests, also contains elements that resonate with biblical narratives. The laws ascribed to Manetho's Moses bear striking similarities to Mosaic laws in the Bible. For instance, Exodus 20:3, 5 prohibits worshiping gods revered by the Egyptians. Exodus 8:22 records Moses informing Pharaoh that the Israelites would sacrifice sacred animals. The Israelites roasted the Paschal lamb, Exodus 12:8-9, and Moses established numerous laws that contradicted Egyptian customs. Levrams 18:3. It seems improbable that Manetho possessed the biblical knowledge or Jewish connections necessary to compile his Mosaic laws. Therefore, the possibility that elements resembling the Exodus originated from priestly sources with first-hand knowledge of historical events surrounding the biblical Exodus should not be dismissed. In conclusion, a significant national crisis during the reign of Amenhotep III appears highly probable. If epidemics, as suggested by Kozlov and others, were indeed a major factor, Amenhotep III becomes a compelling candidate for the role of the Exodus pharaoh. This argument gains credibility from the potential alignment of the biblical narrative with the historical events discussed in this paper. Moreover, Manetho's accounts, which involve a thutmosid pharaoh and Amenhotep III prominently, could represent some of the earliest non-biblical evidence supporting key aspects of the Exodus story. If you enjoyed the video, please support me by liking and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to share your thoughts and the topics you're interested in the comments. See you in the next video. God bless you.